In times of despair and looming destruction, what can truly protect a nation surrounded by overwhelming forces? Imagine a small, virtually defenseless city on the brink of being crushed by the world's most feared empire. Jerusalem, encircled, stands on the verge of collapse, and the faith of one king becomes its only hope. But is that faith enough to stave off destruction? What would happen if an army of 185,000 soldiers faced the power of a single angel? This is a story of tension, mystery, and divine power, where the lines between the natural and the supernatural blur. Prepare to discover one of the most extraordinary accounts in the Bible, where the impossible unfolds before the eyes of a desperate people. 2 Kings 19:35. Hezekiah's story challenges human logic and reveals the true meaning of faith and divine intervention. Why is this specific account so crucial for understanding God's power over nations? What can this story teach us about trust, fear, and the unknown? As we explore the details of this historical event, you'll see how the fate of a nation was decided in a single night of terror. Prepare to be captivated by a story that is not just a lesson in history, but a powerful reflection on the role of faith in the darkest of times. 2 Kings 19:14-19. Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, ascended to the throne of Judah at just 25 years old, inheriting a kingdom steeped in idolatry and a people estranged from God. 2 Kings 18:1-2. His father, Ahaz, had led Judah into a deplorable spiritual state, promoting the worship of pagan gods and leading the people away from God's commandments. But Hezekiah was different. Determined to reverse his kingdom's spiritual decline, he initiated a series of religious reforms that would redefine the course of Judah's history. The young king chose to break with the past and restore true worship to the Lord, ushering in a period of spiritual renewal in Jerusalem. 2 Kings 18:3-4. The religious reforms Hezekiah implemented were both profound and bold. He ordered the removal of high places where the people worshipped other gods, smashing carved images and destroying the idols his father had allowed to thrive. 2 Kings 18:4. Among his most symbolic actions, Hezekiah destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses had made in the wilderness, an artifact that had become an object of idolatrous worship over time. These reforms were not merely a matter of religious policy. They represented Judah's renewed commitment to the God of Israel and the rejection of the false gods that had led the people into sin. 2 Kings 18:4. Hezekiah's faith and trust in God were remarkable, setting him apart as one of Judah's greatest kings. Unlike his predecessors and successors, Hezekiah placed his full trust in the Lord in all his decisions, both personal and political. 2 Kings 18:5-6. The Bible describes him as a king who trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. 2 Kings 18:5. This deep trust manifested in his daily actions, governing with an unwavering commitment to obey God's commandments, leading his people in the path of righteousness. Hezekiah's devotion was not just a public act, but also a reflection of his private life and personal relationship with God. In times of peace, he sought divine guidance to lead his people, and in times of crisis, his first response was always prayer. Hezekiah understood that the true strength of his reign did not come from powerful armies or political alliances, from faithfulness to God. This unshakable faith made him a singular leader, capable of inspiring his people to follow the same path of devotion and trust in the Lord. 2 Kings 18:6. Under Hezekiah's reign, Judah experienced a spiritual revival, and the nation began to prosper once again. The restoration of worship to the Lord brought not only spiritual peace but also material blessings, as the kingdom began to recover from the wounds inflicted by years of idolatry and disobedience. Hezekiah showed the people that when trust in God is placed above all else, he is faithful to respond and protect his chosen nation. Yet the greatest test of faith was still to come when Judah would face a threat no human army could defeat. 2 Kings 18:7-8. Hezekiah's journey as king of Judah was deeply marked by his relationship with God. And that relationship would be tested when the shadow of the Assyrian Empire fell over Jerusalem. As time passed, Hezekiah would face challenges that would make even the strongest hearts waver. But as a man who clung to God's promise, he would confront these trials with a courage that transcended human logic. What would happen when the greatest military power of the time decided to crush Judah? How would Hezekiah deal with the overwhelming pressure and the threat of total destruction? The answers to these questions reveal not only the character of the king, but also the power and faithfulness of the God he served. 2 Kings 19:9-10. The tension in Jerusalem reached its peak as the mighty Assyrian army encircled the city. Future seemed bleak, and Judah's security hung by a thread. Inside the walls, fear and uncertainty spread like poison, and the people wondered how they could escape this desperate situation. Hezekiah, the king who had restored the worship of the Lord, now faced the greatest challenge of his reign. How could he protect his nation in the face of such an overwhelming threat? Crisis was real, and time was running out. The Assyrians, led by the relentless Sennacherib, were poised to annihilate Jerusalem. Hezekiah's actions would be crucial to the fate of his people. But what do you do when all options seem to lead to disaster? The king knew that his faith in God would be tested like never before. What followed would be a confrontation not just of armies, but of beliefs, where trust in God would be put to the test in one of the most critical moments in Judah's history. Faced with the Assyrian threat, Hezekiah made a difficult and uncertain decision. In a moment of desperation, he attempted to appease Sennacherib by paying a heavy tribute, even stripping the gold from the doors of the Lord's temple to meet the enemy's demand. 2 Kings 18:14-16. This move, though pragmatic, reflected the panic that gripped Jerusalem. Yet the tribute paid did not bring the peace hoped for, but instead ushered in a new cycle of humiliation and challenges to faith. Despite the heavy tribute, Sennacherib was not satisfied. He sent messengers with new demands, making it clear that he would accept nothing less than Jerusalem's total surrender. The messengers mocked Hezekiah and even God himself, attempting to undermine the faith of the king and the people. 2 Kings 18:17-25. For Hezekiah, this was a profound blow. His attempt to save the city through diplomacy had failed, and now he was faced with an even more difficult choice: trust in the strength of his enemies or in God's promise. Hezekiah was facing a spiritual crisis beyond a military one. The words of the Assyrian messengers were a direct attack on his faith and the trust of his people in the Lord. For many, the situation seemed hopeless and doubts began to arise. However, Hezekiah knew that this battle went far beyond walls and swords. It was a test of faith, a moment when he would have to decide whether to fully trust in God, even when the odds seemed overwhelmingly against him. The siege of Jerusalem was not just a military battle, but also a psychological one. The Rabshakeh, one of Sennacherib's officers, excelled as a master of this war of nerves. He delivered a speech in Hebrew, the people's language, with the intent to weaken their faith and sow despair. He compared the God of Israel to the gods of the nations that Assyria had already defeated, openly questioning the Lord's ability to protect Jerusalem. 2 Kings 18:28-35. The Rabshakeh's strategy was clear. He wanted to break Jerusalem's moral and spiritual resistance even before any combat. By speaking directly to the people, he sought to undermine their trust in Hezekiah and in God, offering empty promises of safety in exchange for surrender. Pressure was intense, and the people's silence in response to these words was a testimony to their loyalty to the king and their faith in the Lord. Under Hezekiah's orders, they remained silent, demonstrating a resilience that defied human logic. 2 Kings 18, verse 36. That silence, however, was more than mere obedience. It was an act of faith. Hezekiah had instructed the people not to respond, knowing that this was a test of their trust in God. As the enemy continued to mock and challenge, the people of Jerusalem, under their king's leadership, chose to trust in the Lord, believing that he would do what seemed impossible. This trust would be the pillar on which Jerusalem's salvation would stand, in the face of one of the greatest threats the city had ever faced. Amid the despair, Hezekiah did what a godly king should do. He sought God's guidance. Tearing his clothes and putting on sackcloth, symbols of deep humility and repentance, he sent messengers to the prophet Isaiah, seeking a word of comfort and divine direction. 2 Kings 19:1-4. Hezekiah knew that the battle he faced was not just against the Assyrian army, but also a test of his faith in God, only one who could save Jerusalem. God's response, delivered through Isaiah, brought relief and hope amid the chaos. The prophet declared that God had heard Sennacherib's blasphemies, that the Assyrian king would return to his land without ever entering Jerusalem. Moreover, Isaiah prophesied that Sennacherib would be killed in his own land, a promise that reinforced God's justice and power over all nations. 2 Kings 19, verse 5-7. This message renewed the faith of Hezekiah and the people, assuring them that God was in control, even when everything seemed lost. Hezekiah's search for divine guidance was a demonstration of humility and dependence on God. He recognized that without divine intervention, there was no hope for Jerusalem. Isaiah's response not only promised protection, but also showed that God was aware of every detail of the situation. This strengthened Hezekiah's faith, preparing him to trust in God in the darkest moments. The story was about to reach its climax, the promise that the enemy, so confident in its victory, would be undone by the power of the God of Israel. As the crisis in Jerusalem deepened, all eyes turned to King Hezekiah. The situation seemed desperate, with the immense Assyrian army poised to annihilate the city. Yet, it was in this moment of despair that Hezekiah's true faith shone. The Assyrian siege would not be won by human strength, but by the direct intervention of God. What was about to happen would be a divine act so powerful that it would alter the course of Judah's history and leave an indelible mark on the faith of God's people. The climax of this narrative does not take place on human battlefields, but in a sacred space where a king, on his knees, seeks the salvation of his people. This crucial moment reveals that when all human hopes fade, it is in divine power that true salvation is found. The story of Hezekiah and Jerusalem reminds us that, at the height of danger, divine intervention not only defeats enemies, but also reaffirms God's absolute dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth. When Hezekiah received Sennacherib's letter of threats, he knew he was facing a crucial decision. Instead of succumbing to fear or attempting a last, desperate resistance, Hezekiah made a choice that reflected his deep trust in God. He went to the temple, Jerusalem's most sacred place, and spread the letter before the Lord. His prayer was sincere and fervent, a plea for God to intervene and save his people. Hezekiah did not just ask for survival, but for all to know that the Lord is the one true God. 2 Kings 19:14-19. God's response was swift. Isaiah, God's prophet, brought a message that reaffirmed Hezekiah's faith. God had heard the king's prayer and promised that Sennacherib would not set foot in Jerusalem, nor would he shoot a single arrow against the city. 2 Kings 19:20-34. This divine promise was a powerful confirmation God was in control, regardless of the imminent threat. For Hezekiah, this message was not only a relief, but proof that his trust in God was justified. The power of earthly armies would be insignificant compared to the Lord's might. Hezekiah's prayer in the temple was a sublime example of how genuine faith and the pursuit of divine guidance can bring extraordinary answers. Hezekiah did not rely on military alliances or political subterfuge, but instead placed his full trust in divine intervention. This trust would be rewarded in a miraculous way, demonstrating to all that the God of Israel not only hears the prayers of his people, but acts decisively to save those who trust in him. Jerusalem was about to witness one of the greatest miracles in biblical history, an event that would reinforce the faith of future generations. That night, as the vast Assyrian army rested in its arrogance, confident that Jerusalem would be its next conquest, the heavens bore witness to an unparalleled act of divine power. The deep silence was broken only by the invisible presence of an angel of the Lord, who descended like an irresistible and relentless force. Without a single sword being raised, without a single human voice crying out for battle, 185,000 soldiers fell dead, like leaves before a tempestuous wind. Kings 19:35. It was a devastating blow, an epic demonstration of God's power, protecting his people with a supernatural might that transcends any earthly force. As dawn broke, Sennacherib, the proud Assyrian king, found himself facing a scenario no leader, however fierce, could have foreseen. The battlefield, which he believed would be the stage for his victory, was now littered with lifeless bodies. An army annihilated by an invisible and invincible hand. The glory he sought had turned into deep and unbearable humiliation. Without glory, without triumph, Sennacherib fled in disgrace to Nineveh, his capital. The defeat was not just military, but spiritual. He had challenged the living God and was crushed by his justice. 2 Kings 19:36. Sennacherib's ultimate fate completed the picture of divine justice. Back in Nineveh, while worshiping in the temple of his God, he was betrayed and murdered by his own sons. A tragic and deserved end for one who dared to stand against the Lord of hosts. 2 Kings 19:37. This final act was confirmation that God's power not only defends, but also judges with unwavering precision. Sennacherib's downfall echoed as an eternal warning. Human power is insignificant in the face of the majesty of the God of Israel. Jerusalem's victory was not merely a defense against an enemy, but a triumphant proclamation of the Lord's absolute dominion over all nations and kings. After witnessing God's grand intervention in defense of Jerusalem, we are led to reflect on the deeper meaning of this story. It is not merely a historical event, but a powerful demonstration of divine sovereignty that transcends any human power. What does this narrative teach us about God's character and the role of faith in our lives? Revisiting the crucial moments of this story, we are reminded of the importance of trusting in God, even when circumstances seem insurmountable. This story invites us to consider how God's power manifests in our own lives. Hezekiah faced a crisis that in human eyes seemed unsolvable. Yet his unwavering faith and pursuit of divine guidance paved the way for a miracle. Likewise, we are challenged to trust in God during our moments of adversity, knowing that He is capable of accomplishing the impossible. The story of Hezekiah is not just an account of divine salvation, but an invitation to live a faith that defies human expectations. Jerusalem's victory over the Assyrians was more than a simple defense. It was a clear reaffirmation of God's sovereignty over all nations. God protected Jerusalem, not just for His people's sake, but to honor His covenant with David, showing that He is faithful to His promises. This divine protection highlighted that God's power is far above any human power and that, in times of crisis, He acts according to His sovereign will. In Kings 9:34. Hezekiah, who had trusted in God during the crisis, was rewarded with the salvation of his people. His faith, demonstrated in his sincere prayers and pursuit of divine guidance, was the catalyst for God's intervention. Judah's future, which seemed doomed, was transformed by a divine act that changed the course of history. Hezekiah is remembered as a king who, in the face of adversity, chose to trust in God, and that choice brought about a miraculous salvation that echoed through the generations. 2 Kings 19:35-36. This story shows us that, regardless of the magnitude of the threat, God remains in control. His sovereignty is unchanging and infallible, and those who place their trust in Him are protected and guided, even in the most challenging circumstances. Acknowledging this sovereignty is essential to understanding the relationship between God and His people, and to seeing that, ultimately, He rules over every aspect of creation, from the smallest details to the greatest kingdoms. Hezekiah's story offers a powerful lesson on faith and trust in times of adversity. When all seemed lost and Jerusalem was on the brink of destruction, Hezekiah's faith became the anchor that kept hope alive. His trust in God, demonstrated through his prayer and actions, paved the way for divine intervention that changed the fate of a nation. This narrative reminds us that, even in the most desperate situations, faith in God can bring forth miracles that defy all human expectations. Beyond faith, this story also teaches us about divine justice. Sennacherib's defeat was not just a military victory, but an act of God's justice. The Assyrian king, who blasphemed against the Lord and challenged His authority, was punished in an exemplary manner. This divine retribution underscores the fact that God does not tolerate arrogance and blasphemy, and that He defends those who trust in Him. God's justice is inescapable and impartial, showing that, in the end, all enemies of God will be judged. Finally, this story challenges us to reflect on our own relationship with God. Hezekiah's faith and the justice meted out to Sennacherib remind us of the importance of living a life of trust and obedience to God. When we face crises, we are called to follow Hezekiah's example, placing our complete trust in the Lord, knowing that He is capable of protecting and guiding us through any adversity. And in doing so, we can expect to see God's hand powerfully at work in our lives, just as He did in Jerusalem. The story of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, is a powerful reminder of how faith and trust in God can change the course of history. In the face of an apparently insurmountable threat, Hezekiah chose to trust in the Lord, rejecting surrender to human power and seeking divine intervention. His sincere prayer and unwavering faith brought forth a miracle that saved Jerusalem from destruction and demonstrated God's absolute sovereignty over all the kingdoms of the earth. Hezekiah shows us that when we face crises, we must turn our hearts to God, trusting that He is capable of accomplishing the impossible. The defeat of the Assyrians and Sennacherib's humiliation were not merely physical victories, but spiritual triumphs that reaffirmed God's dominion and divine justice. The story challenges us to live with the same trust and obedience to God, knowing that He is faithful and just. Just as God protected Jerusalem for the sake of His name and His covenant with David, He also calls us to trust in Him in our daily struggles. May this story inspire us to seek God in all circumstances, believing that He is sovereign and that in His justice and power, He will always act on behalf of those who trust in Him. As you reflect on this account, consider how faith in God can transform not just a nation's history, but also our own life's journey. After listening to this story, how would you apply Hezekiah's unwavering trust in a difficult situation in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments on how faith can shape our decisions in times of crisis.